We all enter marriage with the dream that we're going to live happily ever after. And some people do, but unfortunately, some people don't. And the journey that we go through when we are hit by a partner who takes the boundaries to levels where we get really hurt by infidelity is something that ends up hitting us in such different ways. Whether we perceive it or we don't, it's somehow lodged deep within us. But remember one thing, no matter what you go through, that everything that ends brings us into a different path into our own selves to bring us stronger, more into tune of who we need to be. Welcome to Let's Get Real. My name is Glenda Kroll, and I am here today as one of your hosts. And my side partner here is.
Hey everyone, I'm Nicole Harvick, and I'm very happy to be here today. I was going to tell you, Glenda, do you realize this is our last podcast for August, and then we're going into September? Summer's almost over. We're going into fall. It's been a crazy 2 years, and I always look forward to this, and I always look forward to our guests because we're here to bring you information that is going to enhance your life in some way or another. And today is no exception. And our guest today is a certified relationship coach. He is a podcast host that specializes in infidelity recovery. And that is something that, my goodness, I wish I could have listened to some podcasts when I was going through my trauma with my ex. I didn't even think about something like that, but I can't imagine how important that must be to some people who are really trying to make that jump into what appears to be normal again. So I think that's amazing. He helps people to rebuild and to heal. And I think that's one of the most important things that we can do. The healing is very important, but we have to rebuild our whole lives sometimes after something like that. And it's not always easy. So our guest today is Luke Shillings, and he's going to talk to us about what he does and how awesome he actually is. So, hi, Luke.
Hello.
Luke.
How are you? Great to be here.
I'm good. I'm so glad you came back. You've been on before, and you are just a wealth of knowledge. And, you know, like I talked about, all three of us sitting here have something in common, unfortunately. And many people that are watching or will be watching have that in common as well. And I never realized how many people were affected by this. Is it becoming more and more common? Or did I just start seeing it after I was cheated on?
Well, I think it's probably more of the latter, as in it has always been prevalent amongst, as long as human beings have the ability to have relationships, and they also have the ability to deceive and betray and cheat or just fall in love or lose their path or not really understand where the flaws are in their own relationships, and maybe it's insecurities. I mean, the reasons for betrayal are vast and varied, and although it's very easy to look at it in a very black and white or a simple binary kind of thing, particularly if you're the person who has been betrayed, like I was in my own story, it's very easy to look at it from that perspective and only see that one side of the story. But I think the true thing about betrayal and infidelity is that everybody involved is hurting. There is no, it's not a competition. It's about understanding how we can use these situations as catalysts for growth and as a way to pivot our lives, whatever that looks like, whether that's rebuilding the relationship with the primary partner where the affair occurred, or whether it's to go your separate ways and maintain co-parenting relationships, or whatever that looks like for the individual. And I think it's interesting that we look at the temptation is often to go to statistics. It's like, something happens to you, and I think this applies to a lot of things in life, whether we all of a sudden we find something wrong with our body and we start to panic and we jump on one of the search engines and quickly find a self-diagnosis. Dr. Google is very good at providing us with that. And then quickly look at the statistics about how probable that thing is that it may change into something else, or what the impacts are and all these things. And I think The same is true with betrayal. You know, you become betrayed, you want to try and figure out, you want to realize that you're not alone, you seek this information, you look at the terrible statistics that are out there, which are notoriously hard to pin down anyway. I mean, given that we are talking about a topic where deceit is the primary focus, then getting accurate numbers on it is always going to be, you know, guesswork, in all honesty. But probably more importantly than that is it's very easy to look at the statistics to try and almost sway you into decisions one way or another based on probability, whatever that looks like for the individual. But of course, these numbers, these statistics might work on a larger scale. It might be a way of saying, okay, well, on average, this happens, and on average, that happens. But it means absolutely nothing on the individual level. And that's, of course, where I come in and recognize that whether it is the betrayed partner, the unfaithful partner, whatever role that they play within the infidelity experience, that they're still human and they're still experiencing something, even if they are the one that has made the choice to potentially, you know, damage the relationship. And so I think I see it in a very neutral perspective, despite the fact that I came from a place initially, my original like jump into infidelity was on the receiving end of it, you know, if we want to put it that way. But I recognized fairly quickly on in my journey that just wasn't helpful. That bitterness, that resentment, that everything I was carrying, well, the only person it was impacting was me. And so I had a choice of either carrying on with that weight, that burden, or maybe just popping it down and seeing what life looked like without it.
But we also have to remember that when it happens to us, you know, the other factor is we're never the ones that are just sitting there alone. It's not happening to us. It's happening to our children. It's happening to our family, and everything has been affected by this.
Absolutely.
So being, you know, cognizant of the factor that you've had this thing, you know, we'll call it, you know, I don't even know the word.
Circumstance.
Thank you. The circumstance that has hit us. And, you know, we got to learn. And, you know, I learned this very early on in another relationship that didn't work out, that if we allow that anger and that resentment to reside in our body, we are knocked down before we can, you know, it doesn't do us any good. So we have to learn to move forward from whatever that is. And you make the decision. And sometimes you need to step back to understand what has gone on in your own life and in your own emotions before you can make it. So I think that's the one thing. But like the most important point is we all get hit. Even the person that did that, you know, their life is going to be changing as well as your own life. So
yeah,
it hits on all levels.
Of course. And I have to say, it's very easy to jump to the stereotype and jump to the how we think we would respond in that situation. Of course, when we're actually faced with it, what we feel is not often what we thought we would feel. It's a bit like turning up to a car accident and thinking that you will know how you would react and how you would go and help and save people. But until you're actually faced with that, you've got no idea how you will respond in that moment. And the same is true for experiencing something like this. And I think that can often be what shocks people a lot, because what they're experiencing emotionally isn't aligned with what they thought they would experience. So they experience this cognitive dissonance, or it doesn't align with what society is telling them that they should experience, or what their friends and loved ones are telling them that they should experience. And I remember this specifically for myself in my own journey, where everybody was kind of telling me that I should be feeling a certain way, and this is how I should be doing, and this is what I should be doing. And it's like, well, it just wasn't really what I was feeling. It didn't, I'm not saying I wasn't upset and hurt and angry and felt betrayed. Of course, all of those things were very real, but it wasn't as simple as that. Like it wasn't just a case of, oh, my wife's cheated, so I'm just going to pack her bags and kick her out the front door. It just doesn't work like that. And of course, there's a lot that comes up before that. Like infidelity is, I would say, always a symptom. And it's a symptom. It's a poor choice. I would never recommend it, of course, and there's no justification in that sense, but it ultimately is, there's something else at play, and whether that be a problem within the relationship, or whether that be an insecurity, or maybe a longer lost trauma within the individual who betrayed, there's always something else at play. And unfortunately, when those decisions are made and those boundaries are broken, then yeah, it can hurt a lot of people. But that hurt exists for as long as we want to identify with that hurt, and what we make that mean about us. Like, who do we want to be after betrayal? And that's often a question that I ask my clients. It's like, well, who do you want to be? How do you want this to define you? How do you want to identify after this? And I think that can just start opening that door to looking at it from a slightly different perspective and taking a bit more control back in their life.
I love that. That's
That's
great
good.
content to start with, because we don't really even think of that we are changing during that particular time. And the exact thing what I said is, what do we want to do? We want to fall back into that hardened, angry person who it just spins out of control.
Of course.
Or do we want to move forward? And it doesn't mean that that we here's the old story about when we try to heal from the angers and the issues, it doesn't mean that we're forgiving the person for what they did, but we can forgive so that we can move on. And I think that's the hardest part of it all.
Yeah, and I think that when we think about that anger and the frustration and the blame and the pointing, and obviously again we're not splitting hairs here. Like, there's a definitive action that has taken place, and that has led to a specific set of consequences. But when we think about how we want to, what we want to make that mean about us, like when we think about blame, we're separating any responsibility from ourselves, because we're blamed by definition is that outwards force. It's that way of sort of basically just diminishing all responsibility in some ways to move away. But often when we get angry at somebody else's actions, we're not just angry at them, we're also angry at ourselves for choosing to be with that person. So we berate ourselves for making those choices, and so therefore we're judging ourselves, and that can actually be often the bigger hurt, the harder bit to get over, than the fact that another human being did something that was inconsistent with our expectations, which, when we think about it, is pretty common. People do not do what we think they will do that often. We are pretty inconsistent as human beings. I was speaking to a client literally just this morning, and they were talking about how they communicate with their children. And so if in the morning, after they've got up and then the kids are asking for particular things, she was like, I really, really happily sort of give them what they need and support and respond to them in a particular way. Or maybe there's a bit of conflict, I'll get them to calm down, and it's absolutely fine. Yet if it's at the end of the day when I've been at work and I come back and I'm tired and I'm frustrated and they do exactly the same thing, I lose my rag and start shouting at them and giving them a punishment that it doesn't fit the crime. So the child presented identically, but because of our mood swings, our changes in experience and moments, we are not consistent as human beings. Yet we kind of have this expectation that the other people in our lives should be consistent. They should show up exactly the same way, exactly the right way, all the time, consistently, forever. And the reality is, we just don't.
It doesn't happen. And Luke, for me, I had two emotions that I never saw coming, because I was always that person that said, man, if he ever cheated on me, blah, 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 blah. My emotions were shame and embarrassment that I had done something wrong. And I never really saw that coming in terms of, where did that come from? But I was really ashamed that he had cheated on me. Yeah. And my first thought was, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? Is that common?
Very, very common. Yeah. There's very few people that don't go through that phase, at least to some extent, some much more extensively than others. where you do ask that question. It's like, well, how did I miss it? How did I not see it? Was I not good
Right.
enough? What is it that the other person has that I haven't got? And we just go on this comparison journey. And, there's the age-old adage of, comparison is the thief of joy. And there is never a place truer than when you're comparing yourself to an affair partner. It's never a pleasant place to be. And, at the end of the day, it feels like somebody is choosing someone or something else over you. That's what it feels like. But actually, that's not really kind of what's going on. It's not really about you, as tempting as it is to want to blame yourself and take responsibility and feel that shame. And then you get like a second wave of shame as well, Nicole, where if you have chosen to stay in the relationship, then you've got to overcome, or you feel like you need to overcome, the shame of going against societal expectations in terms of, well, you really should have kicked him to the dirt. Like, that's what I was telling myself prior to it happening, and then it happened. It's like, that's not really what I wanted to do. So well, now what do I do? It's now I'm feeling this like real balance, and it is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it was. And I got over it, obviously, very well. And like Glenda said, utilized so much forgiveness for me. But yes, it is one of those that really, you're shocked. You're just in shock for a long time. So
Absolutely.
Thank you for explaining that to me.
And I also found, like, for me, at the beginning part of it was looking at myself, like I felt something was changing in my relationship. And before I even found out, and it was very funny. I had said to one of my dearest friends at the time, I said, something doesn't feel right. Can you take a look at me? Like, do you think that I've lost my sexiness, my power? Like, is it something about me? And it's so, through the years of coaching, I've heard so many women with the same thing, that we look at ourselves, that we're not pretty enough anymore. We're not, and it's all about how we might have let ourselves go. And that, which again, is so not the way it is. That it has nothing to do with, and we put it all onto ourselves when this goes on.
Because even if the man in the situation is using that as his excuse, then that's still not about you. That's about his own self-confidence, his own insecurities, his own ability to see your worth, not actually about you as the individual or the person on the receiving end. It's never about the individual. It's just not. And that doesn't justify, or it just, there's no way of justifying or excusing the actual choice to betray. Like, that's never okay. There's never a circumstance where it's actually okay. But of course, it's also very rare, actually, that people actively seek betrayal. Like, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, of course. There are people who do repeatedly betray, and there definitely are people like that. Maybe more narcissistic traits, or just maybe they've been brought up in a particular way. And
exactly.
But generally speaking, certainly from much of what I've seen, that's not really what you see very often, particularly in longer term relationships. It's more that two people have just sort of grown apart but not noticed, or they've started to just disconnect in a way that they hadn't really realized, or maybe they've prioritized other things like their children, and the focus has been on the children for the last 18 years, and and all of a sudden they get to this point where maybe it's empty nesting, and you start looking at your partner and you kind of don't recognize them anymore. And we think of ourselves, and I'm sure he's with you. You can sit and think back to maybe when you were 20 years old or 30 years old, and think about how much you've changed in those years. Of course, you're always on this like evolutionary journey of self, in terms of like who you become as a person, who you become as an individual. And then of course you have your partner kind of doing exactly the same thing on their own journey. But the likelihood of those two journeys being perfectly parallel is basically zero. But if we don't pay attention to it, all of a sudden we can look and they're like pretty much as far as the eye can see, metaphorically speaking. And that's often where this disconnect. So it feels like there's something wrong, and it feels like there's something wrong from the unfaithful spouse as well. Like, there's something not right with my relationship. I don't feel fulfilled. My partner doesn't see me anymore. I've never been listened to. All I do is get nagged. It's like there are always two sides to every story, of course. And although every story is completely unique, again, this probably sounds like I'm emphasizing it, but it's like it's never as straightforward as it seems.
No, there's two sides to every story. So it's it's allowing yourself, if you can speak it out, where you can start to maybe, like I think one of the best things that I have always recommended is trying to put yourself in the other position so that you can sort of start to look. To me, it's like looking through the window, because when you start to understand a little bit more, that's when you can sort of get rid of some of the anger that, which I call the poison that comes into us.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And there's a question I often ask myself when I meet somebody or that I find difficult to get on with, or they're just sometimes you can meet someone, it just kind of jars, and there's not that connection there. And when I was younger, I would be frustrated by that, or I'd immediately dismiss those kinds of people, or I'd get angry at those kinds of people, or I would say things behind their back, like that kind of thing. Whereas now, and for many years now, I'm able to look at people that I find difficult to understand, who maybe do things that certainly don't align with my values, and maybe not even values of the majority of people, and ask that question of like, well, what would it take for that person to think that that is the most appropriate form of action in that moment? And we all start out as these little squealing babies that come out, and then we're influenced by, in part our genetics, but then of course our experiences and the people that bring us up, and the schools that we go to, and the things that we see on TV, and which countries we were born in, and what cultures and religions, and there's all of these like insanely complicated elements that sort of push us in these different directions, which make us all completely unique. So although somebody else's decision might seem alien to us, based on everything that they've experienced in their life, actually it's not that alien a decision, whether that be infidelity or just an opinion about which politician you're voting for. It's like it really and I think this is the problem. It's like we sometimes, again, this is where society puts in these definitive markers about what's okay and what's not okay, what's taboo, what's not taboo. But these are all man-made. These are all created by us. And it's like, it's interesting how some people have a line that's here and other people have a line that's here. Well, whose line's right? Just out of interest. And it's like, what even is cheating? Like, what is an affair? Is it just a casual look across the bar at somebody of the opposite sex? Is it a text message with a couple of kisses on the end? Is it a one-night stand? Is it a kiss? Is it a 6 month? It's like, where is the point that becomes? And of course, there is no answer to that question because it's different for everybody. Sounds like I've deviated a little bit, but just trying to sort of really highlight that nuanced area.
Well, it's also, sorry,
go ahead.
No. It's also a conversation that, that is, I really recommend that even when you're starting out in a relationship, of understanding each other's, of where you've come from, what you've been through. All of these things help you to grow so that maybe instead of being shocked that somebody has done something to you, because at that point you feel that it's been done to you, if you understand sometimes the backgrounds of where that person, your significant other, where they've come from, what types of things that are what they feel are normal or abnormal and things like that, that really helps to move yourself also through the next level into a relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where sometimes the honeymoon period can be quite damaging for relationships, long-term relationships. It's such a wonderful experience. There's no two ways about it. It's a lovely feeling, and we go on that emotional, that sort of chemical high, if you like, for the first 3 to 9 months, roughly, something like that. It's often how long the honeymoon period kind of lasts, and then that subsides, and it's really at that point that what we might describe as longer lasting love starts to emerge. But because that initial period is just all bright and shiny and just wonderful, then we tend to turn a blind eye to maybe some of the red flags or some of the information, or maybe we're just not too bothered about that. It doesn't matter, or maybe they'll change as they get older, or maybe they'll change, like all of these things. And so we sort of go through this phase where we kind of turn a blind, or some people turn a bit of a blind eye to certain things, and then before they know it, they're married with a kid, and all of a sudden they realize they don't actually know their partner very well because they never really really went on that journey that you just described, that truly
Yeah.
getting to know one another. And in many ways, it's very sad that it's both sad and positive that many of the people I work with are going through that journey post infidelity. This has been the thing that's been like the wake up call. It's like, okay, now I really want to get to know my partner, perhaps in a way that I just didn't even realize was available to me. And many of the exercises that we can do can really help them with that. But it would be better if this was all educated in school, for example. You were taught how to be in a relationship, and then I'm not saying all these problems would go away, but there would definitely be a differing approach in terms of how people took responsibility for themselves within relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that we've always mostly blamed it on men as the ones having an affair, but even in your case, are you seeing more women now because they're in the workforce, because they're more independent? Are you seeing more women
Yes.
that initiate?
And a straightforward question. It's quite straightforward answer to the question is yes.
Yes. Okay.
And I think that has continually been growing since probably the early 90s, maybe even a little bit earlier. I don't think it's quite 50-50, but I don't think it's far from it. But again, the statistics are notoriously difficult to get hold of, and not that it really matters. But I have, several female clients who have been unfaithful, and I work with them. Some who remain in the relationships, and some who don't. There's definitely a dynamic shift in the last 30 years or so across society between your traditional man and wife and traditional men and women, in the sense that obviously the women have become more empowered and have been able to sort of pursue their careers in a different way, which is amazing, of course. But often that then makes the role of the man change slightly different, and so all of a sudden you start to get this imbalance of power shift. And of course, there was obviously lots of good to that. There's no question, but there was also some downsides. There's some side effects to that as well, where all of a sudden the women are also finding it easier to jump ship, for want of a better word, or to seek things that they perhaps didn't before, to almost to rebalance the scales in some way. And I mean, I'm not here to make a judgment on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I think obviously all betrayal is not good. I don't think it's necessary in relationships at all. There's definitely lots of things that can be put in place to prevent that from happening in the first place. But yes, it has increased, and maybe even there's been a slight decrease in men over the same period of time. Again,
interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have the accurate stats on that. It's just more of a feeling based on what I've seen and the groups and things that I'm in and the people that I talk to. But yeah, there's definitely a shift.
Okay. And I've always heard it's much harder for a man to get over infidelity than a woman. Is there any truth to that statement?
Again, I think that really depends on the individual.
Yeah.
And this is, when I mentioned about statistics early on, it's very easy to look at the general statistics and then make assumptions from that place. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that men, generally speaking, are not as well equipped to deal with their emotions in the same way that maybe women are. We communicate differently, that's for certain, on average. I mean, of course, there are exceptions to every rule, of course, but there are very feminine men and there are very masculine women and everything in between. But if we're looking at a larger scale, then I think there is definitely differences in terms of the way that we deal with our emotions. Men probably have, again, through society, have been taught to man up and big boys don't cry and get over it and all that kind of thing. And a lifetime of that does cause you to suppress your emotions in many ways. So when it comes to these difficult things, these difficult emotional experiences, and they realize that this is where there's a level of communication with their partner, and it's almost like they're talking a different language. Men. I saw it was either a reel or a meme on social media just the other week, and I probably won't remember it exactly, but it sort of caught my eye, and it was just the basic gist of it was that. And again, maybe I'll be called out for this, but that women say what they feel, and men say what they mean. And the interesting thing is that because women say what they feel, it doesn't always align with what they mean, because they're talking about what they feel. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It does, yeah.
And I
It
know that,
does.
again, I know that's not going to be true across the board, but it was an interesting difference. I was like, actually, yeah, I can really relate to that. And I think this is where there is often confusion in the communication between men and women, or between partners, is where, well, one's talking one language. It's like, well, yeah, I'm saying what I mean. It's literally what I mean. I'm literally saying what I mean. And then you're being questioned. It's like, well, no, that's not what you mean. It's like, well, no, it is. That's actually what I mean. And then,
No, really.
yeah, but really, that really is what I mean. And it always makes me laugh when you see these funny sort of memes and reels where you'll see like a couple laying in bed facing the other way, and the woman's pretending. Again, I know this is stereotyping, so again, please, don't cancel me, because it's just interesting, the patterns and observations that we make, and I see it in my own life as well, where the woman's sat there and thinking, oh, what's wrong with him? Maybe he's been talking to that girl at work again, or maybe he's been doing this, or maybe he's doing that, or maybe he's not. And then he goes over to him, and there's a speech mob then saying, why did my motorbike not start this morning? And it's something to that effect. And it's so funny that we're just missing each other.
Yeah, we're just different, and you know what? That we're just born that way. Each of us has our own, male and female, different.
Well, Venus and Mars. So how can we help people so that, what can we start to do that we can maybe change the numbers, or how we can revert them and live in a life where we can actually come together in a little bit more harmony, instead of following apart, and instead of, the other man's grass always looks greener, so let's jump over to that side.
Sure. And I think there's two parts to this one. There's educating the people who have experienced infidelity, which you might think of being too late because it's already happened. But actually, if those people can learn how to rebuild their relationship after a major trauma, then they become a beacon of hope, an example, a representation to their children and the people below them, so that this sort of systemic, or maybe systemic's the wrong word, like almost heritable, where it goes down from generation to generation, like that has to be stopped somewhere. And the only way it can be stopped is if one generation stops it, and then they start to teach their children. They recognize their own flaws. They recognize maybe how they've come to be that way based on their own upbringing, and they can start to question that and challenge it, and not just do things because that's how it's always been done, but start to see it from that perspective, so they can educate their own children. And that can make a difference to have more healthy relationships with solid boundaries, and take responsibility for themselves, whilst also being respectful and loving and caring, and all of the things that go into being in a healthy long-term relationship. But then I think there's also some responsibility, although this is much harder, dish to cook, so to speak, is at the education level in the first place, in terms of actually incorporating this, or at least some part of this, within our education system. There seems to be two things that we're not really taught about very well, and that's relationships and money. And I think they're two major gaps in the system that could be filled. And I think there are lots of individual groups and societies and things that are approaching those things, but on a country-wide level or on a global level, I'm not so sure that that's really the case, because you can treat the symptoms after the effect, or you can it's that prevention is better than cure, I suppose, is the simple sort of analogy that I would use. So yeah, I think that's kind of the two ways that it could be done. And yeah, it's a shame that it has to happen to then have the solution, but that is the nature of being human, I suppose.
The nature of the beast, right? And I see some slow growth, but occasionally you'll hear someone say they're teaching mindfulness at school, or mindfulness classes. And I remember that when I think my daughter was a freshman. But you can't start when they're in high school. To me, you have to start much earlier, because that's when it's going to embed in that little
Yeah.
subconscious mind to be kind, to be thoughtful, to recognize the other person's needs or emotion. So I think it's right now, I would say too little too late. So I don't, do we stand up and just, we need mindfulness. We need a lot, but when they're little, they could at least start with mindfulness and kindness and,
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
awareness.
Yeah, that awareness.
Awareness.
And of course, a lot of the ways that we enter into relationships and how we think relationships should or shouldn't go is based on what we see. And that's usually from our parents, or at least the people closest to us. That's the most natural thing. And sometimes we can repel and do the exact opposite of what we've seen in our childhood. And sometimes we just end up doing the same thing, whether we were really aware of it or not. So there's a lot of responsibility in that sense on parents and adults in general to at least, I think that taking responsibility is probably the biggest part. I think betrayal is never going to stop, simply because in some ways I think betrayal is almost inevitable, like in the human condition to some extent. We betray ourselves all the time. Our brain betrays us all the time in terms of our perception of what we see. We can trick ourselves. The brain tricks us all the time. You see all these optical illusions. That's just these simple examples. Even just the fact that we think our eyes move smoothly from left to right, but what actually happens is our eye takes a picture there and then it basically goes blank and it fills in the gap. The eye shoots to there and then starts looking again, and the brain just fills in the gap. Our eyes do not move panoramically smoothly.
Interesting.
We don't notice these things, and there are so many things that our brain filters out. Often I'll sit there with clients and we can, for example, we could be sat like we are now and say, I don't know whether you noticed, but you can see your nose like the whole time. It's been right there, but our brains just filtered that out because it's unnecessary information. But the problem is like, well, who's making that choice? Who's choosing what we see and what we don't see? Who's choosing what's right and what's not right?
Exactly.
And so in many ways, we're kind of hardwired to betray ourselves, in which case then it's possible that we're going to betray others. And again, maybe this isn't always at the infidelity level, but just as a generic kind of like the human condition, I think it's really interesting to sort of consider the differences and maybe just how we can look at life in a very different way. And I think the taboo element doesn't help either, because like anything, and then maybe this is one of the reasons that money doesn't get taught, is because it's kind of taboo to talk about money in a lot of societies. And that's probably not very helpful. That's probably why wealth often stays in smaller groups and societies. And again, I'm obviously drastically oversimplifying, but the fact that it is a more taboo topic, it doesn't get spoken about and taught in the same way. And betrayal obviously makes sense, and there are various other categories I'm sure that could fall into that taboo thing. So it's a bit like mental health. It wasn't that long ago that mental health full stop was a very taboo subject, and it's got a lot better in the last 2 decades, last 3 decades. It's definitely improved a massive amount, and it's much more widespoken, much more widespread, and much more accepted. And because of that, people can start to work through those things. And I think the same is true for betrayal. Otherwise, you just end up shaming yourself, or feeling shamed, or feeling guilt, and that often pushes us to do things that are even worse than the situation that we got ourselves in to begin with. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's also one area that we haven't even touched upon, and I think it's really important, is the fact that we don't seem to listen to one another. So we're so worried about getting our point through instead of hearing what the other person said. And so often you're living in the same house as that other person, and you're clueless of what has been said or what they're doing. And, you talked about how we tend to change, and you move in one direction and I move in the other. One person's maybe growing a little bit more than the other or whatever. And a lot of that has to do that they're just not connecting because they're not actually even listening to begin with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that it's conflict is another thing that comes into mind when we think about this listening. And
Yeah.
I always think of conflict as being one person just misunderstanding the other person. You have an opinion, I have an opinion, and basically conflict is when I'm not prepared to accept your opinion for whatever reason, and you're not prepared to accept mine. That's where we get stuck. And when that happens, we end up just throwing things at each other. We build a wall between each other. We shout at each other. We turn them to storm off, or whatever it looks like. But the point is, it decreases connection. It moves us further away. Whereas if we could sort of just momentarily put our hat of curiosity on and say, well, okay, well, why is it? It's a bit like that question I asked earlier. It's like, trying to understand why somebody might think that was the most appropriate form of action. It's like, well, why does Glenda see it that way? And how can I maybe just try and put myself in her shoes, use a bit of empathy, and try and sort of position myself in a place where I can try and understand it from her perspective. I haven't got it to hand, but I often use a piece of paper and hold a piece of paper up to the screen that's blank on one side, and I swear blind to my clients that it says whatever is written on the paper, and they're like, but it's a blank piece of paper. I was like, no, it definitely says this, that, and the other. And of course, you turn it round, and sure enough, there's writing on the paper. We're both looking at the same piece of paper. We're just looking at it from a different perspective. And if I'm not prepared to take the time to consider what the other person sees, and they're not prepared to take the time to consider what I see, then we end up in conflict, which increases that disconnect. So it really is that active listening, that just taking that moment, and also being willing to be wrong. Like, you might not be right. I mean, there's 8 billion people on the planet. The likelihood that you have all the right decisions and right opinions about everything is pretty low. There's a good chance that somebody else might know something you don't. Maybe. So it's like, just like, how can we use that and learn from each other? Because not only do we learn, but we increase the connection, we build the trust, we feel safe, and then we move forward and take it from there. And sometimes that even is to agree to disagree on particular topics, but be respectful in doing so.
And the other area I think that really encourages the disconnect more than anything else these days is our good old-fashioned phone.
Oh yes. These little black mirrors. Yeah, absolutely.
In some respects, where does the infidelity begin? It begins in some ways. Yeah. Just as I say with the listening, so does the phone, because people are just more involved with what's on their phone than what's in front of them.
Absolutely. And you see it everywhere, unfortunately, which is quite sad. And I think technology has played a big part in terms of the increase, and that also probably does explain the increase in female infidelity in the sense that they can communicate in ways more discreetly that just simply weren't available 30 or 40 years ago. There simply wasn't a way of doing it. The man was going out to work, the stereotypical American dream or British sort of family household. That was that kind of dynamic. It was pretty common for parents of not my generation of parents and above it would only ever be the man that was going out to work, and the mother would be stay at home, look after the kids, household, all the things. And so the opportunity just didn't exist in the same way. So it doesn't necessarily mean that men have any greater proclivity to wanting to betray. They just had more opportunity. Mm-hmm. So, it is interesting that you give people choices, and sometimes they make poor choices, and that's how it is.
Yeah, and the phone makes it almost effortless. You just click in a few numbers and write your little text. Boom, gone.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's interesting that.
You can do it I was just going to say, you can do it when you're sitting right by your spouse.
Of course you can.
As I found out.
So easily. Yeah, absolutely. And that's really common as well. I saw it in my own situation, and I also see it in many of my clients' situations. But then the other impact that technology can have is after the betrayal has occurred, or maybe even whilst it's being suspected, is the ways that we can check in and spy and observe the behavior of our partners, which is also incredibly unhealthy. And although I understand the desire to want to feel safe, and have that security of like, I just want to make sure that they're definitely doing what they're saying they're going to do. Of course, that doesn't really build trust at all. If you're in a relationship where that your partner's watching your every move, and you go out to the shop and that that they're sat on there watching a tracker, it's like, That's
Yeah.
never
Is it
that's
worth
never
it?
going
Yeah.
it's never going to solve any problems. It's never going to help rebuild trust. But it's absolutely available to us, and it's tempting. And there are lots of people online who want to be able to try and sell their products or services to be able to do that. But I would definitely not recommend.
So, as we're coming closer to the end of our session, I want to talk briefly about rebuilding trust. How do we go about rebuilding trust, whether it is a relationship that is over, or even rebuilding trust within ourselves? Because once something has broken off, and let's say your relationship is over in your own heart, you have to rebuild that trust within yourself, because that's when we start to doubt our own selves.
Yeah, absolutely. And you went straight to that rebuild that trust in yourself, which is where we have to go. The temptations to want to believe that it's all about the trustworthiness of the other people, of our partners and the other people in the world. But that is fairly subjective. I deliver an in-person workshop quite regularly, and it's usually to a group of about 20 guys, and part of it is it's a trust workshop, and in that workshop, one of the questions I ask sort of midway through the workshop is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you trust me? And 10 being you trust me with your life, and 1 being you wouldn't trust me with a barge pole. And of course the numbers that I get vary significantly. Interestingly, not always within 1 to 10. I actually got a -10 once, which I was quite proud of.
Wow.
But the point is, the numbers are all different. And if all these guys witnessed the same speech, they witnessed the same, I'm stood in the same place, I've got the same whiteboard, I've got, all the things are the same. So if it was about my trustworthiness, then surely everybody would mark me the same. But of course they don't, because everybody's subjective ability to trust is far greater than the trustworthiness that I portray. Is subjective in that sense. So then, of course, it turns inwards, like you say. It's about how do you rebuild that trust with yourself. And I think unless you've got some trust with yourself, trying to trust others is incredibly difficult anyway. So it's almost like there's not really much point in looking at that yet until we start that first part. And I think there's many different routes to this, but maybe the simplest way I can maybe put it is, imagine that you have a situation, so like betrayal, and you feel anger and you feel sadness. And these are quite conflicting, although they're both on the negative side of the emotion sort of spectrum. They're quite different in terms of how they feel. One's it wants to react, it wants to go, it wants to blame, it wants to get a shout, it wants to scream, it wants to, prove it's right, it wants to, really make itself heard. Whereas the sadness and the hurt is much more withdrawn. It wants to hide away, it wants to disconnect, it wants to just be sad and be alone. And like these two opposing parts. And I almost imagine it a little bit like little mini people inside your own head. I don't know if you've seen I think the Disney's version of was it Inside Out, I think it's like a great representation of this. And this is kind of how I've always seen it. And I remember when Inside came out, it's like, oh, this is amazing. It's just how I kind of see emotion. And it's a bit like, you imagine you've got like anger in one side of the room and it's facing one way, outwards, and it's trying to make its point, it's shouting, it's banging on the door, it wants to go, it wants to get out of that. And then you've got sadness over the other side of the room that's a bit more quiet, it's just trying to sleek away. But these two parts of you are like not even looking at each other. Like they're almost barely even acknowledging that each other exist. So there's this kind of pull, and you sort of in this almost like this sort of this loop, this cycle of sort of anger, sadness, and you don't know where you stand, and it's just a really unpleasant place to be. So one of the things that we can start to do is kind of just metaphorically get those two parts of it just to turn around and maybe just look at each other. Like, just in your own mind's eye. It's like what would it look like if that angry part of you started to look at the sad part of you? How would it interpret it, and vice versa? And maybe it would initially start with saying, oh, you're a loser, you're what you're doing, you're a waste of time, and maybe that would be how it starts. But we are gifted with this prefrontal cortex. We're like this, we've got this decision-making part of our brain which we can use to kind of narrate and control and nurture and guide these internal parts of us. So over time, we start to see how we can get these two opposing parts of us to communicate. just even a bit like that communication we were talking about before. It's like, how could one of them become curious to understand why the other one feels the way it does, and vice versa. And eventually we might even get to a point where they can sit down at a table together, a little metaphorical table in our mind, and have a chat and have a conversation and accept and acknowledge each other's parts. Like they're not, yeah, like, I get it. I understand why you're angry. And he also gets that. I understand why you're sad. And like, well, how can we use this shared energy, this shared effort to be able to do something that helps us as a whole rather than fighting against each other internally? So that's kind of like the basis of the framework of how, or at least one of the ways that we can start to rebuild that trust. It's just by getting those different parts of us to actually communicate with each other, and we just act as kind of the guide, and then we all aim in the same direction. And of course it's more complicated than just anger and sadness. There's often lots of emotions going on and they're all fighting for their own little bit of space, but the basic premise still being the same.
Too often in life, we sit back and we spend so much time in that anger, sadness, and it's a sort of like a dance that we sort of sit and we think. But one thing I want to point out to people that are watching is, remember when you've gotten into that relationship, at the beginning it wasn't that way. Something drew you into the relationship, and I think that's part of the most important thing is as we try to heal. And like, this was part of my healing as well, and I think it's an important thing to say that as you have gone through it, you've got to come back to the good times, because if we don't start looking at the good times, you start to look at and getting very angry or negative about life. So start to bring in some of the good things that brought in that relationship. What did that relationship do that was good for you in that time? Because if we sit there and we focus only on that negative aspect, we turn into that negative Nancy who's just sitting there, and she's allowing, when we talked earlier about our friends who tell us, well, you got to get rid of him. He's no good for you anyways. You were better for da 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 da. But if you can stop the negative talk by saying, well, you know what? If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have my kids. I wouldn't have this. These are the things that we all have to do, because the only way to get out of that dance of anger is to start focusing on some positiveness.
Yeah, that story we tell ourselves is so important. And we can walk out of a relationship and regret everything that came before and be, oh, we just wasted the last 10 years of my life. Like, you can tell yourself that. Like, there's no one telling you that that's not okay. But like, how does that feel? Like, what does it feel like when you tell yourself that? Is that really what you want to take away from that? And is it really true? Like, and usually the answer is no. Of course, there's often a lot more there. Yes, the end might have been very painful, and yes, the end might have not been the way that you wanted. And there may even be parts that you can reflect back on and recognize that you can learn from, so that you wouldn't do again in another relationship. But okay, that's great. That means you've learned something. So we're always either learning or growing. You only fail if you quit. So just keep moving forward.
I love that. And that was I think the best synopsis that we can really look at. And, can you give us one of your biggest ahas during your relationship and how you came back that really helped you in your own life?
Yeah, I think for me, and I've thought about this a lot over the years, and I think the biggest sort of shift for me specifically was when I changed the focus from putting my kids and other people in my life, but at the time it was my kids, like, at number one, which seems like the right thing to do, and it seems like the societally expected thing to do, and it's what everybody else is telling me I should do, and it's kind of what I thought I should do.
Yeah.
But at the expense of myself. And once I really noticed that, and I started to truly prioritize myself, in all areas of my life, then interestingly enough, the kids get the best version of me anyway. So it always comes down to that aircraft analogy. You know, if those gas masks come down, those air masks come down, you put your own on first, because you can't help anybody else if you can't breathe. So, and I think that's so true, and that really did help me in a way that I perhaps would not have predicted that it would have done.
Wonderful. Luke, thank you so much for joining us today. It's such a pleasure, and it's such an important subject that we need to talk about a little bit more. And, you know, especially people getting married, you know, these are conversations that, you know, there's nothing wrong with parents coming together with their kids and having these conversations before the relationship, when they're starting their relationships, or any part, even as we talked about through school.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. And we never end our sessions without our truly wonderful lady here. Nicole, tell us what you think of today's session.
You know, there's so much important information here, just in terms of what you can do, what you can't do, what you shouldn't do. Just there's like Luke says, there's no two situations that are the same. So we're all going to see things differently. And, you know, for me, as I reflect back on mine, I don't know that we said this today, but I think something that's very, very important is to know yourself. And I was at a point where I didn't know myself back then. You know, I thought, okay, this is horrible to say, but okay, I'm getting older. I want kids, you know, and I even had a mother-in-law that told me, she says, he's got one in every port. And I didn't listen. But like we talk about, we're going to reframe it. And the good things that came out of it are I have two amazing daughters, and I absolutely adored my in-laws. So I told them I got them in the divorce. So we remained very, very close up until they passed away. So I look at it as had I not married him, I wouldn't have those girls. I wouldn't have had those amazing in-laws. I wouldn't have had all those fun times with family. And I certainly wouldn't have been able to help people in the capacity like I help them today, because everything we're talking about, I experienced. And I think to truly help people, you have to at some point have been mired in that same circumstance to be really, really helpful. So Luke, everything you shared was absolutely amazing and so helpful. So again, thank you for being here today.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
And for anybody, if you know somebody going through a relationship, hard times, whatever, remember, it's great to share. When you share, you know, caring is sharing. Pass on this video to anybody that you know, and give us a comment below and tell us, what did you find from all this session? And for those who want to contact Luke, below in their description is his link to where you can contact him directly. And thank you very much, Luke, again, for joining us and for making today a very special day.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.